Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me again today is Dane Wigington, founder of Geoengineeringwatch.com, a website that I highly recommend you pay attention to have him back on to discuss a very concerning topic for me, something that you've been watching me read over and concern myself about, trying to research as much as I can around the developments of nanotechnology, which, by the way, I've been researching and discussing for a very long time, but there's so much information as it continues to evolve. And my worry is about the dark corners in regard to that technology that we don't see, where it really is today versus what we're told, what it's actually capable of versus what we're told in the news or what the government tells you is coming, and discuss the overlap, the intersection of that alarming technology and all its different facets, from nanoparticles, nanotechnology, virus-sized transistors, self-assembling nanotechnology, and where those intersect with the conversation of geoengineering, or the injections we're discussing, whether we're talking about smart dust level, the kind of aspect of spraying this kind of stuff from the sky, or these are more, or whether we're even able to achieve that at this point. As I just had a great interview with Jay Cooey about this, where he argues that that's being researched, but not necessarily possible. And I want to get Dane's thoughts on where this really is, because he's been researching this for so long. And I do believe this is one of the most important conversations, even if it has yet to happen yet, because of where they're building toward. So, Dane, thank you for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have you on. How are you?
Pleasure and an honor, Ryan. And in regard to these technologies that unfortunately many are still holding to the narrative that it's proposals or in development, and so much of that has long since been deployed. So we're trying to move the conversation past that smokescreen of we could, may, might do this someday. It's been ongoing for a very, very long time.
And exactly my biggest concern. And, I do understand the, at the very least, being careful in a position of science to the argument being that the at least from what the perspective I just framed, being that this is being worked on, is being studied, and just as far as he can tell hasn't been achieved yet, kind of a mindset, more of a cautious stance, not to say that it for sure isn't, but I'm with you on that sense. My mindset is, I see enough evidence to, I think, provably show you that this stuff in some cases is being used, and how it overlaps with already things that have been deployed in a very alarming way. Just speaking just on the injection, not even to get into the things that we can't really, that the average person would say you can't prove. But I agree that I think this is a very prominent conversation right now. And I'm even beginning to wonder whether it is directly causing a lot of the stuff that we talk about in different health conversations and otherwise. And I'm sure you've got a lot of opinions on that. But let's start with the conversation just of geoengineering, because this is something that, obviously the mindset and the focal point of my conversation today, where I want to take it, is how that intersects with this topic of geoengineering. But for those that know your work, and, you've been ringing this bell longer than anyone I know, and really highlighting geoengineering and the concern, which, by the way, again, is a topic that's now kind of like becoming, we know that, even though your battle has been trying to prove that it even exists. And up until it's, by the way, it's a funny way this works. I'm sure where it's fake, you're a liar, up until, oh, now it's real and here's why, and you're still somehow a liar. I think that's a hilarious way that always goes, right? Yeah, comment on that, since that's just a funny dynamic we all deal with.
It is true. And in this case, where we still have the vast majority of so-called academia pretending that we could, may, might have to climate engineer someday if things get bad enough, when anybody who's not clinically blind can see this going on in our skies, right, has been going on for 75 plus years. And in the case of the condensation trail false narrative, when we have up close film footage of these aircraft at altitude, nozzles visible, turning dispersions on and off, that's the end of that debate. These right. are dispersions. This is not, quote, condensation. And anybody should stop to consider condensation doesn't behave in this manner. You don't have a auto exhaust system when you start up in the morning on a cold day and you see condensation coming out of that exhaust pipe. And that's 100% combusted air, by the way. A high bypass turbofan jet engine is only 10% combusted air. 90% is non-combusted. So it's very incapable of producing a condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. But you don't see a cloud hovering over a car that's got a condensing exhaust, or if you see a researcher in Antarctica and his breath is condensing, you don't see a cloud hanging over their head. And condensation, again, doesn't behave in this way. This whole condensation trail narrative has been patently false from day one. So back to what you stated, this position of so many in academia that pretend things are proposals that have actually been long since deployed. And that's exactly the case here, Ryan. We have the climate science community describing everything we see in our skies, aircraft dispersing particles to block the sun, turn the sky hazy, filthy white, toxic fallout coming down to the ground, destroyed ozone layer, disrupted hydrological cycle. All of it's happening right now, and yet they still pretend that it's not.
I mean, it's just infuriating. And I agree. The fact that you even have to, probably even in this episode, it's probably frustrating to even have to yet again explain why this is real. It's obvious. And I understand that. I know that this is a real thing. What's important is for the average person who may have just stepped into this, kind of what we were saying before, how nice it is to see that there are a lot of new people who are suddenly just not just like aware of this stuff, but suddenly going, I'm willing to entertain things that might have been resistant before. And so that's nice to see that. And I think a lot of that's happening with this conversation. So I'm so glad that they're finally seeing that. But you're right. This is a very old conversation. This has been provable for a long time. And I will reference people to your work first and foremost, and just cite things like this, like we talked about last time, like basic ignition of a program, which, by the way, to your discussion has been going on a long time, but this is Harvard discussing the 15-year costs and plans. So whether it was done or not, very clearly a real thing. And this brings us to the point that you recently referenced in your on your Twitter feed. And here's your Twitter account, by the way, as well. And here's the, I also include, by the way, that your link to your amazing documentary. But you made an interesting point here in this video, this article, and I want to go through it really quickly. And it's about the idea of injecting reflective particles into the sky, kind of like what could go wrong. To your point, acting like this is some new, profound realization. But what's really crazy about this is that, so first of all, just for those that are out there still disputing this, here's the Wall Street Journal discussing exactly that, injecting reflective particles in the sky in order to save us from the big bad climate change, which is completely debatable in and of itself. And basically saying, well, I mean, why don't I just let you describe what this is about so I don't have to read through it, and why this was an important point to make, which brought you to the point about nanoparticle rain, which is what I wanted to get to. But what are your thoughts on this article, and why did you highlight it?
Looking at like many other sources that continue to produce this type of report, that now what they have marginalized for so many decades, now they're acknowledging that we, quote, could, may, might do the unthinkable, which has already been ongoing for 75 plus years. And in regard to the discussion of climate anything, as we talked about off air, our position at geoengineeringwatch.org is this: how can we have any legitimate discussion about the climate from any perspective without first and foremost addressing this issue? Right. And we have groups on all sides of that particular debate that are expressing their opinion while ignoring climate engineering, which makes their opinion completely invalid, whatever it may be. So again, I think it's reasonable, rational, and in fact, inarguable to say that there's no legitimate discussion about climate anything without addressing this first and foremost. In regard to the nanoparticle discussion, these particles don't exist naturally in nature, and including the elements we're talking about. And for those that don't know, because we have the climate science community pretending that, well, we should see aluminum in our rain. That's patently false. Aluminum does not exist in free form in nature, period. It's always bonded to other elements. If we have free form aluminum in our precipitation, and we do now, which makes it bioavailable, which makes it incredibly harmful to all life forms. For those that don't know, aluminum is harmful to all life, period. No exceptions. It's now in our precipitation, which means it's in our air column, which means it's in all of us. Every person we test, hair, blood, urine, all packed with this metal, building up in our systems. It's synergistically toxic with other metals, which makes it more harmful still. So again, there is no regard for the consequences of what they're dispersing into our air column. And in fact, Ryan, and I'll leave it with this, I would argue that the fact that we're all getting dumber by the day, and we are, this affects our cognitive ability to be inhaling these types of elements. That also serves those in power. It makes a population easier to manipulate and control if they're not firing on all neurons. Does that make sense?
100%. 100%. And I mean, and overlap that with what right now is, again, something else we should already know for decades by now, but is now being proven in a court of law, that fluoride is also a neurotoxin, or glyphosate is, or, I mean, you could go off for 25 minutes about the different things in our environment, and our food and our clothes and the air that are actively working in, in a synergistic fashion in some cases to make us,
yes.
It's horrifying. Again, that's a conversation for an entire show, which we probably should do. But so this is the important part on this for people to understand. And this is why I'm harping on this point, just to show you some of these things that Dane highlighted in this clip, which I'll include. It's saying, first of all, taxpayer funds. So if you're not okay with this, realize that your money is paying for them to do this. And first of all, even the testing in outdoor methods. So that does not seem to me to be something that is contained, first of all. Then it goes on even further to tell you they do, in fact, have 3 field experiments that are underway in the United States and overseas. So showing you that this is not some, isolated concept. And again, the larger point is we know and have proven this is not and is a worldwide thing and is not just some little testings. But my point is that it's proving and admitting that they're actually doing it out in the open and saying that they're now spraying briny mixtures with the nanoparticles we're discussing to reflect the sunlight from the earth, as if that's already been decided, right? And that's the alarming part. Also, an Israeli startup is involved in this. And of course, they won't disclose the composition of the proprietary particles, which you made fun of in your clip. It's just shocking to me. Or things like putting what amounts to a big tablet of Tums in the ocean to reduce the acidity. Like, this stuff is alarming as hell to me in regard to what the fact that it's being debated at the highest levels of science. And just think this is the kind of stuff that will never come back from, in my opinion. So if you have any comments on just that, go ahead. And then I was going to jump to the next point.
You're correct. I mean, the point of no return, which we have passed about 2 decades ago in regard to the planet we've known, although we've been incredibly poor stewards of planet Earth, and I don't think there's any rationally arguing that, the intentional intervention in the planet's life support systems with highly toxic elements is the most destructive of all. Not only is it, again, contaminating the entire planet, every breath we take, you correctly mentioned synergistic toxicity. We all have mercury in us, for example, from coal-fired power plants, amalgam fillings, perhaps vaccinations. In the case of mercury and aluminum, we all have aluminum in us now as well from the air we're breathing. Those 2 metals in combination, the synergistic toxicity can increase the overall toxicity by as much as 10,000%. That's 100 times worse. And we don't have any study on many of these other elements, which certainly adds further fuel to that equation. So it's a wonder of any of us can function at this point. But the gravity of this threat cannot be overstated. Again, not only toxifying our entire planet, using weather as a weapon, it's destroying the planet's protective atmospheric layer, starting with the ozone layer, which is radically depleted at this point. The former NASA contract engineer that works directly for geoengineeringwatch.org is currently concluding, based on our ongoing testing, that globally there's approximately 23% of the ozone layer left, not 23% depleted, 23% left. That's less at the polar regions, more at the mid latitudes, but we are in incredibly dangerous ground here. No ozone layer, no terrestrial life on Earth, and most aquatic life gone as well. And we're talking about extremely near-term threats, Ryan, on the current rate of ozone destruction, of which climate engineering is the single greatest factor destroying the ozone layer. We're talking about a functional collapse of the ozone layer this decade. That's how close we are to hitting the wall, and they're not going to stop these programs unless or until they're exposed, and the public and the military that are participating, their family members, realize what they're participating in. Our only chance is a critical mass of awareness.
See, this is really fascinating. And since you mentioned it, if you'd like to go further into the synergistic aspects, please do, because I mean, it's an important topic. I'll include this as well in regard to Stephanie Seneff and Danny Rancourt had a conversation. Stephanie Seneff, PhD, talking about the synergistic aspects of glyphosate with the injection, the spike protein. So there's a lot of this stuff happening. I think that's interesting. But to your point there, I find fascinating. So we've all heard of the ozone layer, right? We've all heard of this. There was a big push about this conversation, back however many years ago in regard to, exactly this kind of conversation, but from another angle, saying essentially that we need to stop polluting the planet, climate change, because it's hurting the ozone, which is going to hurt, same kind of conversation. But we had this great conversation in our last interview entitled Geoengineering and Climate Change, Gambling with the Human Species. And this was a great conversation because you make the point about that, it's not necessarily that there's not a problem. I make the same point about hurting the planet. We're destroying this planet. It's not to say that's not happening, but the argument they're making from the carbon aspect to control us is not accurate as far as I'm concerned. But you make to the point about the ozone layer is something that was focused on, yet we don't hear about it anymore. So to that same point, you're arguing there is actually a problem, but they're just not trying to solve the problem. They're trying to use it to achieve their own ends. If I understand that correctly, and explain why we're not talking about the ozone if it's that big of a problem at this point.
Well, certainly we have disaster capitalists. We always have. In the case of wars, we have certain institutions and entities that are profiting off both sides of the conflict. But that doesn't mean the conflict didn't happen. That doesn't mean people didn't die. So the same must be remembered here, because so many people look at individuals like Al Gore, who owns stock in the very companies he claims to be fighting. He's obviously profiting off whatever's happening in the climate. But does that mean we should ignore the damage done? And that's where we need to be very discerning. So in this case, with the severity of what's unfolding right now, those disaster capitalists, I would compare them, Ryan, to, as I have in the past, it's like a pirate filling his pockets with loot on a sinking ship. How much good will that do them in the end? And we are on a sinking ship. Whatever a person's perspective is, the notion that this paradigm will continue much longer is a very naive notion. If we look at statistical mathematical trajectory, species extinction rate, right now, today, we're losing 200 to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect to extinction every single day. Many of those species haven't even been identified yet. That ratio, that's 15,000 times the background rate. Because, Ryan, you hear people say, well, species have always gone extinct, it's part of the process. No, not at 15,000 times the background rate. That's 1.5 million of normal. There's nothing normal about that. We will not continue on this trajectory much longer. And I would argue in the coming weeks and months, the severity of what's unfolding right now will make it apparent to many more that the party's over. And Ryan, you may have just seen Texas just had temperatures in the mid-90s. Did you see that in the middle of winter?
Yeah. I've seen some pretty interesting difference. Go ahead. I've seen some differences.
So mid-90s in Texas. In China, they just had a temperature of 62 degrees below zero. How can you possibly have that kind of anomalies happening? So we have different aspects of climate engineering that many are unaware of. So underneath the high pressure heat dome, which can be created by frequency transmissions from installations like HARP in Alaska, causes an electrical chain reaction in the ionosphere. And they're using that to manipulate the jet stream. So you can be under a high pressure heat dome, which is what just happened in Texas. Again, that is not nature. And in China, 62 degrees below zero is not nature either. That's chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. So when they create these flash freeze events where it goes from 80 degrees to snow in a day, and that's becoming the norm now, that is not nature. They're chemically nucleating cloud moisture, creating a toxic surface flash freeze. That's an aspect of climate engineering that no one but geoengineeringwatch.org is acknowledging, and I hope that changes.
Me too. Well, so this is this in your eyes an experiment to try to achieve a certain outcome at our expense, or is this manufacturing events to justify in the eyes of the people that we have a climate emergency? How do you see that?
It's a double-edged sword, because in many ways they're trying to fuel the division of the population in regard to their perception of the true damage already done to the climate. So when they engineer these flash cool downs, even if it was 80 degrees the day before, people forget about that and think, well, it must be fine. There can't be any warming on the planet because look at this flash freeze we just had. And Ryan, let me rewind back to 2014. You may remember all the headlines about the Boston record snow. They really sensationalized that in 2014. What didn't they tell us at that time? There was no snow, 14,000 foot up in the Sierras in the middle of winter. And about this frozen material, Ryan, this chemically frozen material that now we're told is snow. And there's so many different forms of it now. They call grapple. There's freezing rain is now the norm in the transition zone between the warm side of the so-called winter storm and the cold side. Since when do we have winter storms coming out of the record warm Gulf of Mexico? So this freezing rain is when you have chemically nucleated elements that are hitting the surface before they set up and freeze. And this material, as we see all the snowmageddon we had in California last year, much of this did not translate into runoff because this chemically frozen material tends to sublimate. Sublimation means that it transitions from a solid to a gas and bypasses much of the liquid phase, much like dry ice. Dry ice completely sublimates. There's no liquid runoff. So this is an unnatural material. You don't get as much runoff. That's why in spite of all this snowmageddon last year in California, we are not out of the drought. And even the rain that does fall, Ryan, is toxic. So our trees right now, and I live in the middle of the wilderness. I'm completely off grid, Northern California, nothing but wilderness in every direction around me. Trees are dying faster now than in the middle of summer because the rain that falls is toxic. So where does that leave us?
Right. I mean, the point before, the fact that they're even trying to argue that aluminum is naturally in water, it shows you an inherent dishonesty, like the criminality from people that are pretending to fight for you. But, this is obviously a problem. And so this is where it intersects with the interesting part for me. So what you're talking about there is engineering these things either way, right? Whether it's to manipulate or whether it's to try to experiment to achieve a certain end that we're not even aware of. This is still unnatural, right? So that's obvious. So
it's unnatural and it's malevolent. I want to make that clear that there is nothing benevolent about climate engineering anything. These operations are malevolent. They're about power and control, period.
I completely agree. But I frankly find it sometimes counterproductive for some people who don't want to accept that, but still might entertain the science and what they can prove. But I agree with you. I think you can quite frankly prove that there is something inherently anti-human about a lot of what's happening here. But that's my opinion. But so this comes to an intersection between, again, what I was just showing there, and this comes off the link or the discussion you were pointing to about nanoparticles contamination in the rain and the water. So one side of this is just nanoparticles, right? That's what we're discussing in the aluminum, the barium, the things that are being found in the testing, which should not be there. And it, by the way, provably at levels that are dangerous. It's like
Yes.
in San Francisco, around the world. But there's a difference between nanoparticles and nanotechnology, or there can be. I mean, they can conflate, but the idea being that we're talking about like smart dust. And I still find the word robot to be like archaic. It doesn't even apply anymore to kind of what we're talking about, but that's ultimately the level we're getting to, is like nanotechnology to the point of like virus-sized transistors, robot kind of stuff. The actual level of smart dust, which we can get to. I've got clips and we can show it. But what are you talking about here in your mind? Where do you think that's at? And are we at a point where we're actually dealing with like smart dust level nanotechnology within what you're dealing with? Or is that something that you see in the future, not possible? Where you see this overlapping right now?
Well, certainly when we look at the level of technology now in many arenas, there is likely a depth to this that we can't yet know. But what we do know is certainly more than alarming enough for your listeners so they understand how small a nanoparticle is. As we discussed off the air, you can fit up to 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a single human hair. They're inconceivably small, which makes them bioavailable into everything. They infiltrate all life forms. In the case of us as human beings, as we inhale through our nasal passages, these particles enter through that pathway in the olfactory nerve, crossing the blood-brain barrier. They're in every aspect of us now. And we now know, and Ryan, I know you've seen that the science community is finally acknowledging that the nanopolymers, nanoplastics are showing up in everything, human organs, the human brain, and we have the metals as well, which they tend to try to sweep under the rug. So it's the gravity of this threat, again, can't be overstated. It's in everything we eat. We just had testing done on 85 staple foods, many of them organic, and 84 of those 85 foods all had nanoparticle polymers in them. So again, and there's other elements they're not even looking for. So everything in our world is contaminated. We have peer-reviewed study to prove that there's not an uncontaminated drop of rain on the planet Earth. Everywhere, North Pole, South Pole, top of Mount Everest, everywhere in between. They're contaminated not only with PFAS forever chemicals, but climate engineering elements on top of that, which are not being acknowledged. So how long can we live in a toxic fishbowl and expect to survive when insects are crashing, plankton's crashing, crops are crashing? How long can we survive under these conditions?
Right. I believe we're in what's called the Anthropocene, right? That's the kind of discussion of the sixth extinction movement we're in right now. What's interesting there is, again, predominantly you're discussing particles, right? Which would mean anything that is to the size of, it would be deemed nano size, which I forget the exact numbers if you have it off the top of your head. But so anything, so a piece of dust, a piece of clothing, those are all going to be nanoparticles, which in of themselves you can find, and that's your point, that the plastic side of that, the polymers and the issue there are being found everywhere. The masks that people were forced to wear were full of them, and they're in your lungs, and it's way before that even, right? But so that I think is clear, and that's a problem in and of itself. There's entire studies around how that can be dangerous or is dangerous.
Period.
Right,
Doesn't matter what the element is. When you're talking about particles that small, they are harmful, period. There's no safe level. And now let's add to the fact that we're talking about elements that are harmful, period, and in nanoparticle form. I mean, this is a very lethal equation. You're correct.
Right. Well, you triggered a question there for me. So what about, explain to me how there isn't already nano-sized particles throughout history because we've existed. Is that not Maybe I just don't understand like my point would be that I find your point there at the end, I think is the most important. Dangerous things that are now in nanoparticle size that are now being aerosolized and spread. But so wouldn't we already have nanoparticulate circulating through history just because we've existed, or does it have to be created by human interaction?
Particles that small are not a normal natural element. I mean, we're
Interesting.
talking about a manufactured particle to be, again, 100,000 across the width of a single human hair. So we're talking about a whole new arena in the physical realm that we've not been exposed to before, that we're not adapted to dealing with, and especially when we're talking about these kinds of elements. So again, the gravity of what they're doing with I don't want to say no consideration of the consequences, because they do consider it and they do understand those at the very top of this insanity, those who print the money. And for those who ask that, all roads go back to those who print the money. They control militaries, thus they control countries, they control media, everything in between. But if we look at them as a cancer, as you and I have discussed before, does a cancer consider that its unchecked expansion will eventually kill the host? No, it doesn't consider that. It simply continues to proliferate unchecked. And we're talking about those that are addicted to power, and they are not going to relinquish that addiction. So we're not dealing with sanity ultimately. And those who think that if they ignore this long enough, that somehow it will magically work itself out, good luck with that.
Right, exactly. Well, I learned something right there. I didn't know that. I was always under the impression that nanoparticles were, at least could be naturally. So that's important to know. So that means that in and of itself, the creation of those in just almost what might be perceived as a benign way to the average person are in fact dangerous. I have an article from National Library of Medicine, PubMed, that goes back to, I think, the early 2000s or earlier, just outlining that very point. That nanoparticles in general, here's why they're dangerous. But I always took that more to mean the aluminum side of it. So that's, again, very important to learn this stuff. But so then it brings me to the point about nanotechnology, which is very real. Nobody should be dismissing the reality of where we're at with this, especially as we're being told at every intersection of human with technology right now that that's the future everywhere, right? That's the nanotechnology and the injections and your things in your house. So do you already feel that is happening? Do you feel that there is examples of nanotechnology? And I'm going to the point of smart dust, because I've proven in my research that goes back decades, the actual real world too. I think a company, if I remember correctly, called Smart Networks. It was a government overlap company that was producing these for company use in regard to making smart cities and smart grids decades ago. And they were telling us how they were using it in real time. So it's weird how that conversation got just absent. Like nobody talks about it anymore. And I'll play a clip next, but what do you think in regard to whether that's already been done? Is smart dust ubiquitous, and has it been utilized by geoengineering?
It would absolutely appear to be the case on every front. And by the time we hear about certain specific technologies, it's already been actively used for decades, likely. So I would be in agreement with you on all fronts. And again, there's so many layers to this that we can't yet fully know or understand. But what we do know is more than enough to cause an immediate existential alarm. And the repercussions are now surfacing absolutely everywhere. I mentioned the toxic rain, Ryan. We have recent studies of fish. There was 500 locations of wild caught fish tested throughout the continental US. Without exception, eating one single wild caught fish is equivalent to drinking a month's worth of toxic water. Think about that. So much for nature and people thinking they're eating anything that's uncontaminated. These elements that you were discussing are now permeated into everything in our world.
It's just it's so unnerving. As much as I am, researching this and aware of the concerns, it's just, it's like, you hope you're wrong, like this is such an all-encompassing, ubiquitous problem. So where my concern goes with this is that this gets into the conversation of, here's a good article to bring us over there. As this writes, NIST made sun and rain details. So they're making this, precipitation, how nanoparticles can escape from plastic coatings in the environment. So now you can see this overlap of how you can see different ways that this stuff could either on purpose or accidentally sort of be leached into the environment. And so I want to play this clip really quickly. And this goes back to, so remember what Dane was saying in regard to just nanoparticles and how tiny these things can actually be. Let's get into the concept of actual smart dust, going back to the DARPA earliest aspects of it, the Mu chip, which is another angle of it, that go back 20 years. And I'll show this clip where this is at the MakerCon. It's like a symposium on smart tech, nanotechnology. and he's a leading expert on this field, and he's discussing where it is. Now, this is a 10-year-old video. He's pointing at something that's 10 years old. So it's a 20-year-old tech that he's pointing at. And then we'll discuss it. I think this is pretty important for people to see where it really is. And again, this is a 10-year-old video.
I haven't really seen anything yet. So this is closer to the end of the vision. This is this powder-sized chip, and that's a salt crystal. So this is a small thing. It's something called the Mu chip from Hitachi. It's the smallest commercially available RFID system in the world, and can be pulse-powered by radio waves. It doesn't require a battery. You can literally scatter this stuff like dust or embed it into a sheet of paper. And you know what the really interesting thing about this technology is? This was commercially released 10 years ago. So the inevitability of smart dust. So what is smart dust? Well, smart dust, of course, isn't a new concept. It originated with DARPA back in the 90s. And it's general purpose computing, sensors, wireless networking, all bundled up into millimeter scale sensor modes, drifting in the air currents, flecks of computing power settling on your skin, ingested, monitoring you inside and out. And if you don't think that's possible, this is the Michigan micro mode. It's a cubic millimeter in size. And in deference to the speaker before, yes, it runs an ARM processor. It's a tiny computer, and it features data processing, data storage, wireless comms, and it's probably as close to the true smart dust vision from the early DARPA days as we've come so far. They're designed to harvest energy from the environment around them and to communicate via a mesh network. And of course, the energy is the key problem with this.
So that's the crux of it. And even talking about using your body's energy, so this is a 20-year-old product that was, whatever the image showed, a tenth or more, and that definitely smaller now, as I can prove with the research, the size of a piece of paper that could be scattered like dust, that runs off your body's own energy, that can relay information. And it's just like, how is that possibly a 20-year-old discussion of technology? We know DARPA's been working on this for a very long time. They're at the point of, hydrogels and stuff like that, even further at this point. So how is this conversation not being had? And do you think something like that has potentially been deployed in your opinion? I know we're theorizing here, but you're an expert on this topic. So what do you think about that?
Well, that's an excellent film clip you just showed, and very, very revealing, very damning. And why would we think otherwise? Given that this technology exists, why would we think they wouldn't use it in every capacity they possibly can? There's nothing to restrain them from doing so. So I would, again, think we would be naive to think it's not deployed in more ways than we can probably even identify at this point, Ryan. So I mean, while people are going about their lives and spending their efforts and energy on football games and political theater, this is all going on, and our futures are inseparable from everything we're discussing here in the very, very near term. So one can only hope that people awaken to the fact that these technologies are real, they exist, they're deployed, and the impact to not just us, but the planet's life support systems, the entire web of life, is absolutely incalculable and irreparable.
Yeah, that's my concern, right? I mean, it's something that the point I make about glyphosate, that it's a provable point. That ship has sailed, right? We are drenched. It is in everything we do. It's all around the world. Studies have been done. It's in the urine. And that's what worries me, is that once you're at that point, it's kind of like the government's at a point. Well, yeah, that's just the static reality. So now let us do something because of that, or whatever. It's like you can't come back from it. It worries me.
You can't. No, so you can't. And there's even we just identified and went over that in my weekly broadcast, Global Alert News, which is on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. That's our weekly 1-hour commercial-free update. But we just covered that. Chlormequat, which is a chemical most have not heard of, is now, based on new testing, been identified in 8 out of 10 U.S. citizens. This is yet one more chemical element that's in our system that, again, we can't know the full totality of dispersion of that element, but they just keep surfacing, one layer on top of another on top of another. How much more can we take, Ryan?
Are you talking about the sanitizer quat? Is that what you're talking about?
This is used on crops. It's used.
Okay.
It was
good.
Originally banned in the U.S. The Trump administration first allowed some of that to come in and through imports, and now the Biden administration has basically opened up the floodgate completely. for that chemical to be used on crops, staple crops like oats and wheat, and it's in everything now at this point. Again, 8 out of 10 tested. These tests were recently done. 8 out of 10 have that in their system now. A whole host of downstream effects. And if we look at other elements, again, graphene, for example, that's in our rain. Right. We know graphene is in our rain because the last 100 lab tests we've done, we work with a major international institution on this. Graphene is like a vascular machete. It's in our rain, which means it's in our air column, which means we're breathing that in as well. Again, it's a plethora of toxic elements that are wreaking havoc in our systems. And if we look at even very strong, hardy elements like trees, Ryan, it's killing whole forests at this point. And when you introduce all these elements, you have other factors that come into play. For example, fungal elements. Right. When you fill the sky with these nanoparticulate elements, that's at minimum platforms for fungal proliferation. So now we have all that entering the fray. What happens when you kill off all the beneficial microbiome in a human body? Fungal elements take over. That's when you get fungal infections after you take antibiotics. So when you're killing all the microbiome on the planet, soil microbiome, aquatic microbiome, now fungal elements take over, and we see fungal proliferation throughout the forest now. It's happening in human beings also. So again, it's a total disruption of the entire web of life, a total contamination of the entire web of life, much of which we don't even yet understand. Right. And we're destroying it.
It's just terrifying to me. And so the three main things that I want to get into with the latter part of our discussion here is, and I'm going to go with another one first, actually, because of what you just said, I want to get into both the issue we discussed in regard to the delivery system, the assembling aspect of it. But since you brought up the point about the chemical spray, pesticide, but the reason I thought it was a sanitizer is I used to work with a chemical called Quat sanitizer, and I was worried that is a wildly ubiquitous thing. So I was worried that's what you might have meant. But this is obviously used in regard to food and crops. So this is a very concerning reality here. And so let's talk about the idea of the overlap here of both the nanotechnology side of this, and even where that may intersect with the conversation of like a self-spreading concept of either, and here I'll just show this, by the way, either something like this, which is the work we've discussed in the past from Charles Lieber, virus-sized transistors, where you kind of overlap the bio and the tech concepts where, kind of blurs, which is one of his main points in there, or the idea of like a self-spreading, concept for like a vaccine. But the idea that we just saw in Tennessee, a discussion from at the legislature about putting out a bill that argues that if you go to the grocery store and there's a cabbage with a vaccine in it, that has to be labeled as a pharmaceutical. The fact that we're having the conversation about labeling vegetables as, and we're debating whether it should be labeled, not whether it should even be done, is sort of like either a manipulation to get us looking in the wrong direction. I don't even know. So are you familiar with that conversation about using foods to kind of like relay vaccinations and other, really God knows what else?
I am. I just saw some of that testimony. And again, the term vaccination, I hope people look past that, because that has some sort of implication that somebody's trying to do something good for you, which couldn't be further from the truth, as you know. So that term is basically used to cover up what should be called biological warfare.
I agree. Well, let's just watch the clip opening part of it here.
1894. Chairman Sapicki, you have a motion, a second. You are recognized.
21st.
Thank you, member.
Just a quick background, which I think is really crazy to me. HB 1894 is, so the whole point is he's discussing that we need to label these as pharmaceuticals, which I agree with. But it's interesting to the conversation is like, well, is that happening? It's like we have to wait for it to be on the shelves before we can decide whether or not to label it a certain way. I just think the way that politicians think is mind-blowing to me.
House Bill 1894 classifies any food that contains a vaccine or vaccine material as a drug under the Tennessee Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, defines vaccine or vaccine material as a substance intended for use in humans to stimulate the production of antibodies and provide immunity against disease, prepared from the causative agent of a disease, its products, or a synthetic substitute, treated to act as an antigen without inducing the disease, that is authorized or approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration.
All the watered down variations of the definition now.
Thank you for that explanation of the bill. Do we have any questions for the sponsor? Chairman Kumar, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Speaker. Kindly tell me, I don't
Let me skip to this
We
one.
would deem that a pharmaceutical in Tennessee, sure that we food source drug.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This one.
Can you give me an example of a food that's a vaccine?
You recognize?
Yes, sir. University of California, Riverside has already perfected the ability to put human vaccines into our lettuce right now. Also, tomatoes has the ability to do that also for UC Berkeley. And then Big Tobacco, RJ Reynolds and stuff has perfected the ability to put a human vaccine into tobacco products.
Chairman Clements?
And is that even legal to do in the state of Tennessee?
Right. And that's the crux of the point, right? And he's arguing, well, that's not what the bill's about. It's like, so anyway, I want your thoughts on this in general. So first, do you think that is already happening, in your opinion, right? In regard to what might be happening to foods and so on. And it's interesting to me in regard to the overlap of, what we're talking about with the spraying. Like, and this is just a completely theoretical point, but just a hypothetical, like in our argument here, the crux seems to be to agree on that, one, if it's being discussed, it's probably already happened. And two, that this has been provably done for a very long time. So I worry about the steps like that we might not be seeing now. Like if we're talking about using nanotechnology and these kind of things to create certain aspects, whether we're talking about vaccination or something we'll get to next in regard to what you could deliver with internally in the body. So do you think there's an overlap there in regard to the spraying and what you talked about, just use of nanotech to create an outcome in things that we're not talking about like vaccinations, but food?
Certainly. The overlap is there. And back to what's settling down through our air column and the technologies that we know exist, and likely much more that we don't even know about yet, but that's what we can't hide from. We can hide from vaccination. We can refuse to eat their lettuce or their tomatoes, or we can attempt to grow our own. But what good would that do us when we have these bioavailable elements, again, saturating our air column, our soils, our waters being uptaken in anything we grow as well? There is no place to hide from that. Every threat that you're trying to highlight here, Ryan, and thank you for doing so. If we don't stop what's being dispersed in our air column, we cannot hide from that. And the consequences are manifesting by the day. So we're exposed to everything that you're highlighting on this exchange. And thank you for all your research in doing so. And that's why geoengineeringwatch.org is so focused on what's happening in our skies, because we cannot escape that threat, period. And it's all of the above. It's everything we've gone into on this exchange. And it's simply infiltrating virtually every aspect of our ability to eat, drink. This is a threat we must deal with, Ryan, or very soon nothing else will matter. And at any point in time of their choosing, and I want to stress this, we have what we know, again, are biological carrier platforms, polymer fibers and graphene. They're used militarily for biological warfare. If they feel they're not making progress at their agenda fast enough, if they feel the public is waking up soon enough to cause a threat to them, they can level the playing field overnight by putting something much more lethal in this mix that's already being dispersed in our skies that we're already exposed to. Marburg, Ebola, a hemorrhagic fever of some sort, they can level the playing field overnight.
Right. See, as we continue through this, like I recognize, a level of redundancy in the discussion, just because that the point is the same. And I do think it's important to discuss these and lay out the different dynamics, but your point is the same. It's already being done. And I really kind of just fixating on the point you made there that, we can talk about the idea of the food or the vaccinations or anything else, but if this is, as we know, is constant, daily, all the time, you're right. I mean, it's the biggest hole in the boat. I forget if you made that off air or not, but it was an analogy you made in regard to dealing with the biggest problem, right? And I agree. I think that's the obvious issue, because it is clearly happening and it is clearly building. So in regard to the point of the delivery, like the why of it all, and I think this is the problem that most individuals, I've always pointed out in any of these conversations, that the why matters. It obviously does, but you can't really, it's more difficult than ever to prove intent. So it's about what we can prove, what's happening scientifically and so on. And then we can debate about the intent. But first and foremost, we can just see that it's happening. But in this case, the intent is interestingly important, right? And so what do you think is really the end game here? We talked about the idea of, you mentioned the fibers and the graphene points, which there's endless amounts of research showing graphene and graphene oxide as the next step for vaccination, for delivery of different, medical materials. So you talked about the idea of the biological carrier platform, the pathogen dispersion. So what exactly does that mean, and how do you see that playing out? Explain that to people and why what they're accomplishing there.
Well, to back up a bit and just to give an analogy to what you said earlier, and people don't know intent and they tend to discount what is already evident. So if you find a body in the street and you don't know exactly who was the perpetrator of that person's demise, does that mean that there wasn't a crime? Of course not. There was still a crime in that case, and the same is true here. So just because we don't know all the individuals involved, the entities involved, or necessarily all the motives, doesn't mean that it's not occurring. We have absolute indisputable proof that this is occurring in our skies, that these elements are there, that these repercussions are there. And in regard to those who would ask that question, and many do, and it's their immediate out for acknowledging this reality, why would they do this to themselves? But they already have, haven't they, Ryan? And we've had this discussion before, and how much have they done to themselves already? We have the detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs, which contaminated the entire planet, including them, they, those behind these programs, those who print the money, those who control militaries. They have done this to themselves already. We have Fukushima, triple nuclear meltdown, no technology to fix it, no end in sight. We're building 60 more nuke plants right now. We have 442 online. If we look at that one single issue, 442 nuclear power plants, which will go into full-blown meltdown when society collapses. And I do say when, because that's what most people don't want to face, Ryan. They don't want to face that this paradigm was never, ever sustainable. And that doesn't mean I'm an Al Gore fan. I'm not, or any of the environmental groups, all of whom ignore climate engineering because they're protecting their 501c3 nonprofit. That's criminal hypocrisy. But the bottom line is this trajectory of so-called militarized, industrialized civilization, never sustainable, but those in power have used this to gain that power and that control. They're not going to let go of that. So we're faced with a paradigm of nobody who wants to face reality while the ship is going down and we're neck deep in water on the deck of the Titanic. Right. So the bottom line is, again, those in power will do whatever they feel they have to do to maintain that hegemonic power until the moment of impact, which I would argue is perilously close. We have stock markets hitting record highs while we have about 36 countries around the globe descending into chaos right now because there's literally not enough to eat. Their life support systems, their ability to grow food for their populations are completely collapsing. Their water supply is collapsing. This whole scenario is imploding right now, and we have people pretending that somehow it will be sustained into the future. So again, back to your original question, those who've done this to themselves, looking through their lens, they feel they have no other option but to continue to double down on this insanity until the moment of impact. And that's a very, very difficult corner to try to find any way out of, Ryan. I would argue right now, and I'll leave it at this, right now, what we're fighting for, if we can expose and halt what's happening in our skies, stop the contamination, stop the damage to the planet's life support systems, allow the planet to respond on its own to the damage done, we would at least buy time. And that's worth fighting for.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I don't know. I mean, nobody logical could disagree with that statement. But into the specifics of the actual point about what this could be doing, right? So to what end? And again, this not a mind reader, right? But logically, what you think in regard to the conversation of so we're talking about the geoengineering, the manufacturing of these events, and overlapping that with the conversation of smart dust and these self-assembling graphene nanotechnology conversations. So to what end is kind of the argument or the question, and to what, you mentioned the idea of biological carrier platforms, or you mentioned the idea of the potential dispersion of something like a Marburg. Do you see that being something as simple as just the particles, or are we talking about nanotechnology with the overlap of the graphene? And so, explain that to me. How do you see that playing out? What does that look like? And what's the point of doing so?
I think there's much we can't know, but again, when we know that there's about 400 biolabs around the globe, and this is exactly what they work on, is this type of pathogens. It's their objective. So again, all that would need to have happen is a successful delivery system from the clouds to the ground of these elements without even some of the higher levels of technology. They have the ability to spread these pathogens right now. And again, on the to what end standpoint, it does come back down to what I stated, those in power are going to try to hang on to that power until the brutal bitter end, which is unfolding right now. I would argue this is an unraveling of what was that's occurring right now. And for those that want to cling to this current paradigm and pretend that it's going to magically work out, it's not. But although these technologies exist, Ryan, and although they're certainly being utilized, it's still we're still faced with the equation that if we remain on this current course, I would argue that I would be surprised, let me say that, if we reach the end of this year without significant links in the chain dropping out. And yes, we have the disaster capitalists that are trying to either retain power, control, profit from these elements, but none of those agendas matter, do they? None of them matter. Whatever they're trying to achieve, whether they're trying to achieve a more automated society that serves their interest or fulfills whatever functions that those in power would wish, none of that matters on a planet that no longer supports life.
Right.
And that is what we're hurtling toward by the day. So whatever the agendas and objectives are, Ryan, they will be moot points if we remain in the current course. And that's what we're trying to stress. Many agendas and objectives in play. We don't argue that. The smart cities, the various layers that go with that, but none of that will reach fruition on the current course. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to tease out some of the more specifics, but I'm worried about where it goes, the biosurveillance. And again, specifically the conversation of like the nanotech as opposed to particles, but to the extreme levels of the research regarding influencing thoughts, feelings, actual actions, the ferret nanoparticle stuff, or whether, to your point, whether this could be utilized to assassinate a foreign leader, like I can just see how these things can overlap with all sorts of different things that concern me. But you make a good point that ultimately it gets into the point that you said is moot in regard to it's happening, we can prove it, and that we need to do something to ultimately stop it. And to your point,
we're on the same page. We're on the same page. I mean, I'm not in any way disputing that these objectives are likely a part of their agendas and being carried out to various degrees right now. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, Ryan. I'm simply saying that on the current course, all of those agendas will be moot very, very soon. As collapse unfolds and those in power clearly, if they really, really were a coherent and even looking through their own lens at carrying out their own objectives, they would not have reached this point already. They would not have painted themselves into the same corner with a planet that's completely collapsing in which no one gets out alive. So however deep, dark, and diabolical and this evil genius is, it clearly is not coherent even looking through its own lens. It's going to exterminate itself along with the rest of us on the current trajectory.
Well, that brings me to an interesting point we can kind of end on here that I think is you mentioned something in this, but I've had this thought before, and I don't mean in this point to necessarily have to suggest that it's for some outside entity, but it nonetheless interestingly takes the form, if you look at the big picture, of almost like terraforming, right? Like you're trying to like literally change the makeup, the what's the right word for it? Atmospheric. It's weird to me to see how many different ways it seems that the actions they're taking are almost taking the form of like an anti-human action. Like it's the last thing we would want for the thriving of the human species. So it's odd to me. And do you have any thoughts on if that term even makes sense or why that might be happening? I mean, I feel like you mentioned a part of that to, try changing the makeup of the planet.
I understand your point. Again, what I would argue is this is the term they use to justify what they're doing. It's in their eyes a risk to risk scenario. The risk of doing what they're doing in our skies to the risk of not doing it. And that doesn't mean in any benevolent sense. When they refer to that term and its application, it's only in regard to them retaining their power and control. So again, when we have the type of damage being done from what's occurring in our skies and a power structure cancer mentality that only knows how to double down. The more damage they do, the only response they know how to counter that with is to double down again and again. So we take, for example, the damage done to the ozone layer, which again, by itself, an existential threat. We have methane filling the atmosphere right now, which is a consequence of thawing and releasing methane fields. I'm not talking about cow flatulence. That's simply a distraction to drive a wedge into society also, to think that it's about your cheeseburger we have massive methane fields releasing in the Arctic. I encourage your listeners to search Arctic or Siberian methane craters. Look at the images. It's shocking. It looks like nuclear bombs going off, methane exploding out of the tundra. It's happening on the seafloor. So what do they do to counter that? Project Lucy and Project Alamo. Those are acronyms for the microwaving of our atmosphere with opposing frequencies in a desperate, dangerous, and unimaginably destructive attempt to molecularly degrade that methane. So again, if we look at this through that lens, Ryan, back to your original question, why would they, quote, terraform the planet? I would argue if we look at the entire chain of these events, we see layer upon layer upon layer of insanity stacked on top of reaction to one form of damage by doing even more damage to try to hide the first form of damage. And we end up here. And this is simply the mentality of too many in the human race that are concerned with the next quarterly profit margin and some of these industries, defense industries, and no regard for the consequences, and a public that simply doesn't want to know. They want to go to football games, Ryan. They want to pretend that voting for their particular political puppet will somehow make everything magically better, none of which is true. So it's a very dark equation. And I would argue, I'll leave it at this, Ryan, that we're caught, those who are awake and aware and trying to fight this are caught between the proverbial hammer and the anvil. A clinically insane power structure and a population that's hopelessly asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, I will say, though, that I feel more and more hopeful as just day by day that more people are willing to entertain these things. And I think that's definitely positive.
Finally, as things get bad enough and the food shelves start to empty out and people are dropping dead in the streets from much of what's been done. Yeah, finally that's starting to occur, but it can't occur fast enough.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll leave you with some of the links I had included in regard to recent progress of graphene oxide as potential vaccine carrier, the idea of graphene oxide use for drug delivery system, just to back up what he was saying earlier, and just the worry that I have in general about the idea of the overlap of nanotechnology in regard to how it applies to the medical field, and the worry of like the steps that were being taken in regard to smart, self-spreading vaccines. I'll end with that clip for people to see again, but just the idea of how all of this kind of amounts to, I'll reference the biodigital convergence conversation. This is a US document I discussed where they literally say in 2002, they plan to alter evolution using nanotechnology in 20 years, which is literally where we are. And they come out talking about the biodigital convergence. And, that side of it worries me, but seeing where that intersects with this conversation, the use of nanotechnology with all these, including the geoengineering aspect, I just get really concerned. So to our earlier point, what is happening, what has already happened that we don't even know about? Are we light years ahead of where we think we are, and we're still focusing on surveillance cameras and robots? It's like, that's kind of this weird worry that I have.
I think you're correct, Ryan. I'm with you on this. I truly am. And I think that there's layers to this that most don't even want to imagine that are already implemented. The only part that, or the primary part I think we need to include in this equation, that even whatever their agendas that they've already managed to implement, as we face total collapse, 442 nuclear power plant meltdowns coming, how much will these agendas matter? Whatever grand schemes that they were working on go down with the ship. And that's a trajectory we are on. So it all needs to be considered. And back to, again, the primary point of this discussion, all these technologies, we cannot escape what's coming down through the air column. We can't escape that. We can hide from the vaccine. We can hide from whatever's being engineered into a food supply. We cannot escape what's coming down through the air column. So we're back to, we must deal with that hole in the bottom of the boat. But all of this is a part of it, and I'm with you on that, Ryan.
Yeah, well, and I'll end with the point that I guess that I was hopefully trying to relay here, is that the geoengineering aspect of it is leading to those things as well. I was worried that might be an aspect of it that is leading to the contamination of the food supply, leading to the contamination of the water.
Already has.
It's self-serving. Exactly. Which I think that your discussion today and your insight really opened people's minds to that. And I just I really thank you for your work, Dane. And I continually frustrated that people like you don't get the attention you deserve. And I hope that more people will continue to look at your work and your documentary. And, thank you for joining, man. And I hope that people will listen. And but I believe they are. And I think it's because of work like yours. So thank you for joining.
Well, it's because of voices like yours, Ryan, as well. I'm very grateful that your intelligence, articulateness, and all these issues that you do so much to try to ferret out every day. And we're very grateful for that, for you, for your voice. It's a team effort. And if we collectively focus on our greatest and most immediate threats first, then we can perhaps buy time and focus on the rest. But it's a team effort, Ryan. Thank you very much for your voice.
Thank you, brother. And absolutely. And as always, everybody out there, question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Since the outbreak of COVID-19, the word virus has been dominating media headlines as well as our daily lives. Did you know that one approach that has been proposed to control virally transmitted diseases is by releasing a virally transmitted vaccine? Unlike traditional vaccines, infectious vaccines do not require any individual consent. Infectious solutions are also being developed for food and agriculture and are currently making their way through the regulatory approval process. However, do we really want to intentionally disperse these modified viruses outside the lab?